Everyone, I'm Pam Comfort from Contra Costa, and Ingrid Roberson. Thank you, Contra Costa. Ingrid Roberson unfortunately fell ill this morning, so however, fortunately, joining us momentarily will be another representative of Alameda County Office of Ed, Juan Lamb, and she's very competent, so I think we're going to be able to move along without missing a beat. They sorted the presenters by height, so you know you're pretty close to the end of the day. As soon as they get the people up here who actually can't see over the dais, you'll know it's about time to leave. All right, we're going to talk about the Action, Services, and Goals section. And so I'm just going to basically go through the same thing everyone has done, which is kind of the instructions and the from the template, and then also from the approval manual. So this part of the template remains unchanged, except for the addition of new, modified, or unchanged, where they have to indicate at the top, right? Am I on the right? Oh no, this is where I'm just telling you about the tools that we used, which I just did. Sorry. Okay, and then this section, the only change is where they have to indicate whether it is new, modified, or unchanged from the prior year. Okay, so this doesn't have to do with having a change necessarily mid-year, but we're talking about the prior year. And then the CISESA LCAP approval manual, I forgot to mention, review notes for this particular area. Goals, actions, and services are found in Chapter 4, pages 18 to 20. And then the checklist manual, pages 33 to 36. So one of the things that we talked about as we were going through the idea of compliance versus support for districts is that when we're approving the manual, the LCAPs, it's important for us to remember that we have to have some objectivity in terms of reviewing the district LCAP goals. In terms of approval, goals are locally determined, but that's not to say that a county office wouldn't, of course, share an opinion about the strengths or weaknesses of any particular goal when we're consulting with or providing assistance to a district in the development of their plan, right? But I know if you are like me, you probably have seen some, not so much questionable goals, but certainly sometimes questionable actions and services. So we'll repeat this message in a few moments. But our role is to stick to what's approvable and what's not when we're talking about the review process, okay? My notes just turned off. Thank you. Okay, so, oh, did we already talk about that? What's the number at the bottom, 162? We should still be on 158. Thank you. These are notes come from the review manual and also the template instructions. I already just said this. Go to the next one. I said that. Go to the next one. Okay. So this, as far as this section, the only thing that's changed is that we now, thankfully, have baseline data required, okay? In the past, when they were asked to identify their AMOs, we had quite a few plans from our districts that maybe they actually used percentages and data, but we didn't have an idea, or they weren't going to have an idea of whether or not they made improvement because they didn't have any baseline data indicated. We need to make sure that it refers to either quantitative or qualitative data, okay, that we can understand it, that every one of the metrics is included. Even though there's some confusion in districts, this came up from a question in a prior presentation. Some of the districts are confused by the idea of the indicators right? Which kind of lumps some metrics together and maybe even adds something new. All districts are still required to address every metric, and that's something that some districts have a little bit of confusion about. So we want to make sure they're clear on that. And that they have a metric for every corresponding priority, at least in one place in the overall plan. And that the metrics are described in a consistent way with the way that they're described by the state. So for example, priorities 5 and 6 rates are calculated in a particular way, and if something like suspensions are supposed to be in rates, then districts have to have those metrics described as rates. So one of the other questions that came up was whether or not districts are required to have targets for subgroups of students. And the fact of the matter is, if you're going to be addressing gaps, then it makes sense that you are likely to have targets for subgroups, because how are you going to show that you're trying to close those gaps? There's not anything that specific that says you have to have a metric for subgroups, but logically, if you're going to be addressing actions and services for subgroups of students or for targeted pupil groups, then there will be metrics associated, right? Okay, this is probably the biggest change having to do with the goals, actions, and services section. And it is where districts are required to, or LEAs are required to indicate whether or not they're identifying this particular action or service as meeting the requirements for increased or improved services. And they're only supposed to choose one or the other. Either it is meeting or it isn't meeting. And one of the questions that came up in prior trainings was, how do they determine? Is it based on the funding that's being used? Is it based on the students that are being targeted? Actually, not necessarily either of those. It is a local decision as to whether or not they want to count an action or service towards meeting the increased or improved services requirement. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Those are the directions. So if it's not meeting increased or if they're not counting as contributing towards increased or improved services, then they would only have identified one student group of the 3 options and only one location. And contrastingly, if they have identified it as contributing towards increased or improved services, they have the option of identifying one or more of the student groups that are named. Okay, still only one location. So this is the comment that I was talking about earlier, where it's not necessarily tied to the unduplicated pupil percentage, which was another portion of that question that came up earlier. Okay, just based on your percentage of targeted pupils, that wouldn't determine whether or not you're counting an action or service as contributing or not contributing, right? Oh, go back one. However, the percentage of unduplicated pupils we know is relevant if you are counting it as increased or improved services and you are below the targeted amount, percentage of unduplicated pupils, because then that ties over to your increased or improved services section where you're going to have a rationale, right? That's the only thing that's relevant about that for this section. And then as far as the actions and services section goes, Again, there's the addition of selecting whether or not the action or service for each year of the 3-year plan is either unchanged. What's the language there? What's the new, modified, or unchanged? And then the one, I guess, bit of relief that we LEAs have now is that if the action or service is unchanged, then we don't have to do that cutting and pasting of the exact same verbiage for every year. You can put it in once. If it's unchanged for the remaining 2 years, you don't have to cut and paste it. You can leave it blank. We are responsible for looking back to make sure that if an action or services, if a goal is indicated to be new, modified, or unchanged, that we've confirmed that with the prior year's plan. And then verify if the actions and services as a whole address each one of the state priorities. And then similarly to the comment about the goal, actions and services are determined locally, hopefully based on relevant data and input from stakeholder groups. And we're really not in the position as county offices to make determinations about the potential success of an action or service as a part of the review process. But as entities that are here to support districts, then certainly when we're given the opportunity to provide input, then at that point is where we would maybe provide some advice or input about whether or not an action or service seems appropriate. And you know, what's really going to happen is it's all going to come out in terms of the outcomes, right? That's going to give everyone an opportunity to go back and look at what were the actions and services that we tried to apply to any particular area of need, how effective was it, and now let's revisit that. In terms of the budgeted expenditures, we want to just make sure that section is completed, that the information is understandable, that the expenditure amounts, sources, and budget references are included, and that you could locate each expenditure in the budget using a CSAM classification. So a CSAM classification we know means either using an object code or the description. In our county, we have some districts that use just the code, and some districts that use both the code and description. They're not required to use both. They have the option, but I think it would be, you know, reasonable for us to suggest to districts that using a code doesn't really make the plan more understandable and meaningful and transparent for stakeholders, right? They have no idea what those codes are, most folks that are reading the plan.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to follow the same process. In your packet, there is a green packet, which refers to the goals, actions, and services. This sample was actually pulled from a school district in Alameda County. For one of their goals from last year, there are 4 actions attached to this goal. So what we would like to do is to have some table talk time and individual reflection for about 5 minutes on what we just talked about in terms of what we are looking for in the approval process, and to get thoughts about whether or not we would be able to approve this particular goal with the 4 actions. So about 5 minutes to do that. All right, so apologies if I misspoke earlier. There were actually 5 actions, not 4, if that was confusing. So 1 goal, and there were actually 5 actions attached to that goal. So now we're just going to go through the process of taking a look at what we found in our table groups and also what we found as we were looking at this from the approval lens. So I don't know why the bottom one shows up and the other ones don't. So the first thing that we're looking for is whether or not each goal identified was identified as either new, modified, or unchanged. So in this, did everybody get nod of hands? Yes, that each goal was identified. The annual goals included for all pupils or specific goals for sites in each specific subgroup, including pupils with disabilities. That section was checked appropriately, or the annual goals were included. So this piece is the piece that I'm going to focus on, which is the state priorities addressed somewhere within the goals. So with what you have right now, has not met. But again, because this is one specific goal, it would really depend on whether or not in the other goals all of the state priorities were addressed. So it's a little bit unfair, but just for purposes for this activity, that's what we were looking for. And so that's why that was marked a no. So a description of supporting data, there were metrics to identify the identified need for each goal. That was a yes. And again, this was the same thing as the one before, the metrics that are going along with the goals for each state priority. So with what you have, that would be incomplete. So for the next section, apologies for that. Questions for that? Yes. Yes. You are jumping ahead and great, and I'm just going to skip right over there. That is extra credit at that table, and I really should have known, of course. Yes, and also after lunch, that's extra credit. So here's what we're talking about, which is the actually, no, I'm apologize. Actually, we're going to get to it. I promise we're going to get to it. So it says, it's at the very bottom, this one, is each action or service identified as either contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement or not. So that was the question that was on the table. So if you look at action 1 and action 2, in both of the tables at the top, where it says not included, so I'm actually just looking at action 1 right now, there is the box that is checked off that says specific student groups and all schools as meeting, as not included as contributing to meeting, and then it's also, you have boxes that are checked off in the second one that is contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement. So the question was, can you check boxes in both of those? And the answer is, in this, as we're reading for approval, it has to be or. So we can't have, so the answer is for this action as well as action 2, both of those boxes were checked, and so this would not meet the criteria for approval as it stands. Thank you for that. And then also the other piece of this that I wanted to highlight is on the second page where it has the table. There is where it says professional development under baseline, it says new metric data to be collected. So the baseline data, the question is the second to last bullet here, is the baseline data included for each metric that does not change during the 3-year LCAP period? So because there is not data, there's not a metric and data under the baseline, this actually does not meet the approval standard. So when Dr. Robertson and I went over it yesterday, and as we have been talking about it for these past few weeks, certainly I know that in our county we have quite a few number of districts that have actually put in baseline to be collected. So I know that this is a source of conversation that's going to be coming up in anticipation of this. So I don't know if there's other districts in other counties, I'm sure, that are in the same boat. So I'll just continue on, and then I'll just open up a space for questions as well. So then the next section is asking the question for the actions and services either not included as contributing to meeting or included as contributing, is only one student response selected for students served? The answer is yes. And is only one scope of service identified? And the answer is also yes for that. So there's one box that is checked under each one of those questions. So this is a little bit different for the second box, which is the actions and services included as contributing to meeting increased or improved services is at least one box, one response checked? And the answer is also yes. So at least one box has been identified, and only one scope of service is also identified. And then also, again, just to reiterate, for each action and service, we have identified new, modified, or unchanged. And so the last part of this approval that we're taking a look at for what is required, for each LCAP goal, are annual actions to be performed and services to be provided included. In this particular goal, yes. Under each LCAP are budgeted expenditures listed and described and enumerated. We found that to be true. Are all fund sources referenced for each proposed expenditure? We have those listed below in the expenditures. And are expenditures classified using CSAM to identify where the expenditures can be found in the district's budget? We also found that to be true. And so, yes, question?
On the budget detail, it's my understanding that there were different references for the budget code, but the dollar amount is calculated by those references. So for example, if it said certificated salaries and then contracted services, that the $180,000 example in one would need to be broken down so you could see the dollar amount by the different CSAM reference.
So that has always been I'm happy for Pam to weigh in as well. That has always been our recommendation to our districts as they have been doing the LCAP, is that they would break those down further into those pieces.
So are you saying that's not necessary?
No, so I'm saying that we have, under our recommendations for our county, we have recommended that they do break those down. And so but again, this is what is minimally required, and then what is, what goes further. And I would actually like further clarification on that, because that's a question that I get all the time. We have recommended that they do break it down. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I would say is that anything that's going to fall under a different object code has to be broken out, because the object code is what tells you where you're going to find it in the budget.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I guess if you think of classified by CSAM, those descriptions are in different places. If it was by an object code, it would be in a different place. So, I mean, and if the dollar amount's all one, how can you verify it in the budget then?
Goes to that understanding. Great. Any further other questions?
So based on what Josh said, this example would not pass.
So what we would do, and I'm sure this is what, in many scenarios like this, we would be working with the district alongside, but if this was submitted in June, we would toss it back. But hopefully it wouldn't come to that. So other questions? Okay, good. Yes?
So my apologies for basically asking this question a second time, but we were under the impression at one of our previous trainings that we could have this lump sum as they have written and not break it out by CSAM code or descriptions. And now, did you just say they have to?
There, do you want to take it or you? So this is one. This is so.
So I would probably defer to Joshua, but my understanding is that if we are using a CSAM description to locate the expenditure in the budget, it would be difficult to find them if they were lumped together.
So first of all, my take on this is always the context matters. So I don't feel like I can give you a definitive right answer on this question. I can tell you how I think I would approach it in Napa and see if it's informative for what you would do. But so one, I want to be clear. I always worry about these standalone examples. If this was the only problem in the LCAP, even if I think it's dead wrong, I might not kick it back in Napa County, right? So just to be clear on that. So in my mind, lumping together things that are completely different, what we in the BASH side would call major object ranges, so they really appear in very different places in the budget, I think is problematic if the expectation is you're supposed to be looking for budget alignment, right? Because I don't know if that's $40,000 of contractual and $5,000 of salaries, or $40,000 of salaries and $5,000 of contractual. So now these amounts are not that big in the context of a budget, so maybe it's not material, but generally speaking, I think we would be looking for them to break those kinds of major object range things out separately.
Thank you. Is there another question over there?
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, first of all. But secondly, back to that question about the new metrics. Where did we land on that? Where if they want to use a new metric, especially for the subsequent years, are you suggesting that they just drop that completely?
My comment was about the fact that there are now indicators which might lump a couple of metrics together, right? There's an EL indicator. If they describe the metric, if they describe an indicator rather than a metric, then they're missing a metric. So really just clarifying that we still are required to mention every metric in the LCAP at this point. Does that help?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more of the baseline, where they're saying they don't have any data.
Oh, yeah. That's a good question.
So I can tell you again, and I'm open, part of what we respect about being here is that we're all kind of learning together, because I can tell you what our interpretation of it was, and I would love to hear other people's interpretation. So the way that we read this, pass it, let me find it. So the question was, is baseline data included for each metric that does not change during the 3-year LCAP period? So if there's no baseline data, I'm interpreting that as that does not meet that criteria. So that is our interpretation of what that statement is. So this is us kind of grappling with what the requirements are, but also acknowledging that we do have several districts that have been in this. Now, the other thing that I would say to this is that most of our districts that had missing baseline data won't be able to say that for this year. So I think some of it is, they were waiting for, they were missing API, all of these pieces. So some of that problem will go away. But my interpretation of this is, and our interpretation from our county level is that this baseline data has to be included for each metric.
So what if they're implementing a brand new survey to measure priority 6 or something, and they truly have no space?
So, yeah, the question, I don't know if you could hear me, was what if they're implementing a brand new survey to measure priority 6 and they have no results? And can we hold them accountable to putting the baseline in there in the year 2 of the 3-year plan? Do we ask them to just pick an arbitrary number, stick it in there as a baseline, what they think they should be doing?
So again, I can answer kind of in the context for Alameda County, which is one thing that we know that has been happening with, particularly for a goal regarding family engagement, is that they're implementing a survey, but they are also at the same time on a parallel track using an existing survey that they have already had access to. So it's not one or the other, but it's a parallel track, and so then they switch over once they have 1 year, they're calling it 1 year of a pilot, and then when they switch over, they would be able to use that as the baseline. So certainly we have a lot of cases in that bucket as well. Does that?
In that instance, I'd hold them accountable, but,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of the possible scenario where there is a brand new metric.
I mean, I think the recommendation, so our recommendation for last year was, again, thinking through, you know, if they're in that place where they don't have baseline data yet, then can we support them in getting the baseline and also using an existing tool in the meantime? So doing that starting for this year.
So we can obviously add this to the Google Doc to get more clarification on it and then send that out as well.
Yep.
Can you clarify on slide 174 when you talk about the actions and services not included as contributing?
Uh-huh.
One student response selected for student served and then only scope of service. I don't see where there is a scope of service on that section. Am I reading it wrong? So it'd be the top section for the actions and services on the not included as contributing. And
So
it doesn't give you a spot to do
Right.
a scope of service, so,
Yeah, it was
Okay.
one location for the ones that
okay,
are
got it.
contributing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think we have one more.
I do have a thought as he's bringing the microphone, this issue of the baseline data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. I think you all ought to think about some agreement, and as Efren said, I can imagine from past experience that the advocacy groups are going to be interested in that idea, and if it's one of those where it's all over the map,
Right.
that's problematic for you all. So in thinking about whether they have baseline data or not, if it's a new initiative, or they still should have a rationale for why they are moving forward. Maybe they just have some qualitative, anecdotal information that is the reason for implementing the action or service. So again, there maybe needs to be a little more clarity on that amongst you all, in whatever way it sort of maps out. And the other piece is the budget one. If and I'm not suggesting that's the case, but I know it's very contextualized to the local district, but again, this has been a big issue both for the state board and for complaints from advocacy and parent groups. And you all know this because we've struggled with that budget piece. So coming to some general agreements that everybody's trying to follow in the approval process based on some of the work here that you're doing, I think those two dimensions moving forward ought to be something that you have a kind of sphere of agreement at least, just to avoid bigger issues down the road or getting beat up for no reason.
Yeah, we completely agree with that. Thank you very much.